Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 29, Gridlock. With everyone flipping their desk calendars from May to June, a new breeze was increasingly blowing through the halls of American diplomatic and military authority. That breeze carried with it a feeling that a military victory would not, or maybe more accurately could not, or even maybe more accurately should not, be won in Korea. The 11 months of the war so far had not gone to plan for anyone, on either side, and that was quite frustrating for some people. Specifically, the war hawks back in the United States were upset that the great U.S. Army had not yet won the war when they had won the last one against a far more powerful enemy. They were further spurred on by Douglas MacArthur's mid-May appearance before a joint hearing of the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations and on Armed Services, in which he spoke of many of the same things he spoke of during the last 2 months of his career and in his farewell address, like the need to escalate the war against China to achieve a complete victory for which there was no substitute. That rising national sentiment was slowly pushing on Harry Truman the realization that a different tact was needed to end the war quickly and on his terms as much as possible. Part of that breeze had blown through the offices of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and made its way to Tokyo, where, in early May, Matthew Ridgway had requested the authority to withdraw troops from Korea in case of a Soviet attack on Japan, and in return received a new set of orders redefining his mission in Korea and restricting his ability to move north in Korea. Quoting from Billy Mossman's Ebb and Flow, one of 3 U.S. Army official histories of the war, quote, Ridgway was to make no general move beyond lines Kansas and Wyoming without prior approval. He could go farther north on his own, but only in limited operations designed to keep enemy forces off balance, to maintain contact, and to ensure the safety of his command. End quote. Now, Ridgway had already given a similar order to the 8th Army's James Van Fleet, so this was not much of a change for the Supreme Commander. But Ridgway was a bit miffed that the Joint Chiefs were tying his hands on the matter. Ridgway was most similar to MacArthur in one aspect. Both believed that the commander in the field required a certain level of autonomy in the strict conduct of the war, especially in one that could seemingly change overnight. When Ridgway complained about this to the Joint Chiefs, they pretty much kicked the can over to the National Security Council. Again, this all came to the fore because Ridgway just wanted the ability to withdraw from Korea to protect Japan without waiting for specific approval to do so from Washington. So, the Security Council meets to discuss the matter in mid-May and recommended to Truman, which he accepted within a day, that the United States attempt to find a negotiated settlement for the war. America would work towards an armistice agreement. There could be a substitute for victory. As Truman would say in a late June speech in Tennessee, quoting from David McCullough's biography, "My critics want us to play Russian roulette with the foreign policy of the United States, with all the chambers of the pistol loaded. This is not a policy. No president who has any sense of responsibility for the welfare of this great country is going to meet the grave issues of war and peace on such a foolish basis as that." End quote. The change in official American policy on the mechanism to reach an outcome of the war made its way to Ridgway in the form of a revision to his job description on June 1st. While his main goal was still to maintain the security of UN forces while inflicting maximum casualties on the North Koreans and Chinese within Korea, he was given 4 conditions for ending the war. 1. End combat with an armistice agreement. 2. Ensure the authority of the Republic of Korea over the territory it controls as bounded by a northern boundary no further south than the 38th parallel. 3. Establish a plan for the removal of non-Korean military forces from Korea. And 4. Enable the buildup of the Army of the Republic of Korea to allow it to capably defend itself against future North Korean aggression. The limitations the Joint Chiefs placed on Ridgway in May were further clarified, with all large operations north of the Wachon Reservoir limited and now requiring strict authorization from Washington. Smaller tactical advances to maintain contact or strength of line were still allowed, but the American commander could no longer plan any grand offensives without the go-ahead from the paper pushers back home. The reason the Watchon Reservoir was chosen, and I should have mentioned this a few episodes ago during the battles over the reservoir, is because that reservoir had the capacity to provide a decent amount of electricity to Seoul. Now, Seoul wasn't a shining metropolis requiring gobs and gobs of power, especially after 4.5 battles in the city, but electricity is an important resource for any major city. The main difference for Ridgway between when the limitations were first put on him in May and when they were reaffirmed in June is that, well, now things were looking a lot better for the UN in Korea. The Fifth Phase Offensive was successfully beaten back, and UN soldiers were again heading north. All available intelligence showed a communist force demoralized, understrength, and undersupplied, even if some of those same sources reported the imminent arrival of a new PVA army to reinforce those already in Korea. After the events of May, Ridgway was optimistic that the timing was right for a negotiated agreement. Before that could begin, Ridgway wanted UN forces to advance to the Kansas-Wyoming limit. Operation Piledriver was planned in the last few days of May to get them there, with 3 divisions of I Corps advancing directly to the southern edge of the Iron Triangle and 3 divisions of Ninth Corps occupying the Wyoming line between the Iron Triangle and the Watchon Reservoir. Those advances were set to begin on the 3rd and 5th of June, respectively. Heavy resistance to smaller secondary advances north of the Kansas line confirmed Ridgway's suspicions of the importance of the Iron Triangle, proving the necessity of Piledriver. Even with that resistance, the operation went ahead on June 3rd amid heavy rains. Communist resistance was immensely stiff until the 8th, with their defensive effort complemented by dreadfully muddy roads that were so important to American mechanized forces. As the ground had dried out and the Communists pulled back from their defensive positions, UN units moved into the Iron Triangle between June 9th and 11th. East of the Watchon Reservoir, X Corps and ROKA First Corps continued their operation to close the bulge opened during the Fifth Phase Offensive. By the 4th of June, the First Corps had reached Line, Kansas, with each of its 3 divisions spreading out from the coast into the Taebaek Mountains. They had marched so far ahead of X Corps, partially because of the consistent and devastating supporting fire they received from the U.S. naval presence just offshore, that they left open the possibility of an attack on their left flank. To seal that flank in a large basin named the Punch Bowl, the men of X Corps had to face 3 difficulties, all compounded by the heavy rains. 1. East-west ridges that required constantly climbing and descending steep heights. 2. North-south ridges that forced dangerously narrow advances. And 3. Highly motivated North Korean defenders in well-fortified defensive positions. That last point, the North Korean defenders, was obviously the main issue that was just made all the more difficult by the other 2. Especially considering those defenders often organized rapid counterattacks when dislodged from their positions. That's why Almond had to widen the attack on the 8th with reserve units west of the Punch Bowl. The advancing divisions of X Corps could not reach their objective of Line, Kansas until the 17th of June, far behind their fellow corps. Over in Beijing, the sentiment was similar to that in Washington. The offensives of 1951 had failed. UN forces in Korea were as strong as they had been at any point before or after Chinese intervention. And now, the front line was not that far from its starting point. Chinese commanders, buoyed by their success in the Chinese Civil War, had come into this war confident to a fault in their own abilities and in the abilities of those they led. According to Xu Gangzhang, Mao Zedong was preoccupied with the political prestige he attached to staying south of the 38th parallel, to capture formerly capitalist territory. That's why he pushed Peng Dehuai and other People's Volunteer Army leaders so hard towards the offensive. The pressure from Mao was further complicated by pressure from the leadership of the Korea People's Army, including Kim Il-sung. The North Koreans consistently pushed riskier operations to maintain their own version of prestige, making for a particularly dangerous combination of pressure on PVA commanders. That combination had forced the PVA to undertake 5 offensives with little recuperation in between, totally forgetting Mao's own tenets of military action, such as using strategic counteroffensives when prudent or fighting small-scale guerrilla campaigns instead of grand offensives. Such failures were finally apparent to Mao by the end of May, when he cabled Pang stating that their failures were caused by the confidence the Americans had in themselves to successfully fight against the PVA. He cautioned against overambition in battle, limiting objectives to destroying just 1 UN battalion per PVA constituent army action. If the PVA could consistently chip away at UN strength, the police action would eventually lose support at home and enable the communists to win the war. Mao was even prepared to allow combat in North Korean territory, saying it could take place anywhere south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, showing just how much he believed in this strategy to achieve victory. When Mao sent this same message to Joseph Stalin, though, he received a much cooler response. Stalin warned Mao against attempting to draw UN forces into North Korea to inflict death by 1,000 cuts. The strategy might work once or twice, he warned, but would fail after that as UN forces caught on to the game. Around the same time, Stalin informed Kim that more shipments of Soviet small arms should soon arrive in Korean ports. Kim was ecstatic about that, believing that it meant communist forces could stay on the attack against his enemy. This only increased the pressure he placed on PVA and KPA commanders to switch from their defensive footing to another grand offensive as soon as possible. When Mao forwarded Stalin a memo from Pang with a pessimistic outlook on the conduct of the war, Stalin responded by encouraging Mao to lengthen the war, saying a longer war would build the experience of Chinese soldiers on a modern battlefield, destabilize the Truman administration, and allow them to learn more about American military capabilities. As admirable as that first reason might have been, Wada Haruki suspects the second and third reasons were the overriding cause for Stalin's somewhat sudden reticence at ending the war quickly. Now that UN forces in Korea had reached their self-imposed limit, the question became one of what to do next. There were a couple options. One was to mount an amphibious operation on the East Coast, leapfrogging behind communist lines to land a force at Tongchon, about 70 miles north of Line, Kansas. This would have similar aspirations to the Incheon landings of September 1950, but was deemed too risky by Ridgway and shut down before it really got off the ground. Van Fleet disagreed with that decision, as he believed the Tongchon operation could make a meaningful difference in the outcome of the war, but both men had their orders from above. The next operation was to continue the advance north overland, but again, their orders from the Joint Chiefs disallowed that. Even if such action was allowed, the next best defensive line across the entire peninsula was 75 miles north of Line, Kansas, a distance surmountable only with a heavy expenditure of men and material. Ergo, the third option, staying put on lines Kansas and Wyoming, was selected as the best option within their limitations. Van Fleet's staff also expected another major communist offensive within the next 2 months, which would not be enough time to rebuild any meaningful infrastructure networks north of their current positions. To occupy the time of his staff and to stave off the threat posed by a communist fake-out in the expected negotiations, Ridgway had his staff present a few options for future offensives north from their current positions. The most viable of these options was to send a column up from the east coast and a column northwest from Seoul to Wonsan, land an amphibious force at Wonsan as well, then drive north from Seoul to Pyongyang. Such an operation would be a heavy undertaking, and was only considered as a long-range possibility. On the other side of the battle lines, it was obvious to American observation planes that a potential sixth phase offensive was in the works, with supply stores growing visibly larger and UN patrols meeting vigorous opposition by small screening forces. In early July, Van Fleet's staff estimated that this attack would begin by the Ides of July, but revised that assessment to align it with their own proposed offensive trigger point, the breakdown of armistice negotiations. The first concrete indications that an armistice was on the table came in May. Given that the 25th of June 1951 would be the one-year anniversary of the beginning of the war, a Democratic senator from Colorado proposed that the Senate request the UN to ask all nations involved in the war to agree to a ceasefire for the exact hour of invasion on the 25th. That did not happen, but the Indian delegate to the United Nations, Sir B.N. Rao, did pick up the torch and proposed the matter to the General Assembly shortly thereafter. Tryggve, in his role as Secretary General of the UN, amplified the remarks of a Canadian diplomat by saying that, quote, if a ceasefire should be arranged approximately along the 38th parallel, the main purpose of the Security Council resolutions of 1950 will be fulfilled, provided that a ceasefire is followed by the restoration of peace and security in the area, end quote. The U.S. State Department then directly approached the matter with the Soviets through an arranged conference between George Kennan and Jacob Malik, the Soviet delegate to the UN, at Malik's home on Long Island. Kennan arrived on May 31st, but was rebuffed by Malik when he first raised the idea of a ceasefire in Korea. They met again on June 5th, after Malik had time to discuss the matter with Moscow, and Malik informed Kennan that the Soviet government was not going to be a party to any ceasefire negotiations in Korea, although they would support a peaceful settlement. Malik expressed the unofficial Soviet view that such negotiations could only be done directly with the Chinese and North Korean governments. And Malik made his stance public on June 22nd, announcing on a UN radio program that the Soviets believed a settlement was possible. However, he chose not to further elaborate on that short 15-minute radio address, even going so far as to feign illness to avoid speaking with the President of the General Assembly 3 days later. On July 4th, Malik departed New York and returned to the Soviet Union. In early June, Kim traveled to Beijing to meet Mao and Zhou Enlai, who wanted to convince their Korean counterpart of the necessity of armistice negotiations. Maybe. No one really knows for sure. But I think it makes sense that Kim was hesitant towards a negotiated settlement, considering, he started the war in the first place. What we do know from WADA is that Mao and Zhou convinced Kim to accept a deferred offensive that would take place later in the fall and not as soon as possible. Mao also convinced Stalin to meet with Kim and Gao Gong, leader of the Chinese Communist Party, in the middle of June. At that meeting, Stalin further drove home the importance of a ceasefire, mollifying Kim's concerns by pointing out that a ceasefire would not end the war and fighting could resume at any point. Stalin also acquiesced on sending Soviet military advisors and enough weapons for 60 new divisions to Korea to further strengthen the war effort. Mao responded to Gao's report of this meeting by saying that to ask for a ceasefire now would be a show of weakness. But he was amenable to accepting such an offer from the Americans should they propose one. Once Mao agreed to the idea of a ceasefire, Stalin informed him that they could only provide enough weapons for just 10 divisions, not 60. But there was no going back for Mao. His die was cast. Malik's comments reverberated throughout the halls of the U.S. State Department. They were primarily met with skepticism, including by Ridgway, who was weary of any statement made by a Soviet official given their quote-unquote well-earned reputation for duplicity. In Moscow and Beijing, the mouthpieces of the communist world, the papers Pravda, Izvestia, and Jinmin Pao, all published Malik's remarks, endorsing his proposal for a ceasefire. These were as official a response as would be seen from the communist centers of power for now, as the Soviets wanted to step away from the issue and the Chinese did not want to implicate themselves in their own actions. The only response from Pyongyang came in the form of an altered slogan for Pyongyang radio, changing from "drive the enemy into the sea" to "drive the enemy to the 38th parallel." While the issue was working its way through the semi-official channels of Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang, Truman was gathering support for a ceasefire from the UN representatives of those countries that fought as part of the coalition. Once he received their support, along with a clarification from the UN legal team that no further resolutions were needed to authorize an armistice, Truman empowered Ridgway to make a statement on Tokyo radio to the Commander-in-Chief of Communist Forces in Korea. He did so on June 30th, stating, quote, "As Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, I have been instructed to communicate to you the following. I am informed that you may wish a meeting to discuss an armistice providing for the cessation of hostilities and all acts of armed force in Korea, with adequate guarantees for the maintenance of such armistice. Upon the receipt of word from you that such a meeting is desired, I shall be prepared to name my representative. I would also at that time suggest a date at which he could meet your representative. I propose that such a meeting take place aboard a Danish hospital ship in Wonsan Harbor." Ridgway writes in his memoirs that moving towards armistice negotiations was welcome solely because the communist defenses had solidified along their then-current front. Had he felt that any more progress could be made northward, he surely would have protested to Washington that further gains could be made. But, because of the stiff resistance of communist forces, he looked forward, hesitantly, to meeting his counterparts. Well, to having his representatives meet his counterparts' representatives. On the afternoon of July 1st, the radio broadcasts in Beijing and Pyongyang were interrupted by a joint statement from Kim and Peng. That slight delay in response occurred because it was actually Mao who had written their statement and sent it to Stalin for approval, where it arrived a few hours before a similar statement from Kim arrived via the Soviet ambassador in Pyongyang. Stalin told both to speak with each other and that he could not take a role in the negotiations except to advise on specific issues. After speaking with each other, Mao's statement was published in Kim and Peng's names. They agreed to Ridgway's offer of an armistice discussion, but instead proposed the ancient capital of Kaesong as the meeting place. They also proposed a temporary ceasefire during armistice negotiations and a start date between the 10th and 15th of July, which Ridgway counter-offered with a start date of July 5th. He outright rejected a temporary ceasefire as it would negatively affect UN forces' ability to reconnoiter from the ground and air. The temporary ceasefire was not necessary to the communist leaders, though, and they moved forward with negotiating the conditions for the negotiations. A pre-meeting meeting on the 8th set the official start date for armistice negotiations as the 10th of July, 1951. For the first time in what felt like forever, everyone could see the light at the end of the tunnel. They just could not predict how long that tunnel would turn out. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with United Nations and Communist representatives preparing to meet in Kaesong to discuss an end to the Korean War. Next week, we will discuss, let's talk about that for a moment. The next 4 episodes will deal with consecutive 6-month periods of the war, instead of the 1-month period that we've done pretty much since the beginning of the war. They will also each discuss a larger issue. In no particular order, those topics are air combat and bombing campaigns, prisoners of war, coalition building, and civilians and guerrillas. Episode 34 will be a discussion of the armistice, and finally, Episode 35 will be a retrospective and wrap-up. If there's a topic you'd like to hear about, even if you think it's an obvious one or if you think it's a very small one, please send me an email at ctcapodcast@gmail.com to let me know. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCAPodcast. The references for today's episode are listed at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe, and I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week. Come on, Maya. Come on. What do you want? Okay.